Welcome. Take a moment to relax. Let your breath slow. Tonight, we drift back gently to ancient Egypt, but not the Egypt of golden pharaohs and grand monuments. This is the Egypt beneath the myths, where life was shaped by dust, duty, and sacred routines. Together, we'll unwrap not just mummies, but the quiet, often harsh truths of daily life in one of history's most iconic civilizations. So imagine yourself now, beneath the flicker of a small oil lamp, the scent of resin in the air, the sands cool outside, and the past waiting, silent, within. Let's begin with the one who prepared the dead for eternity. Picture yourself now, in a dimly lit chamber, beneath the sun-baked stones of an ancient temple. The air is thick with the scent of resin, natron, and old cloth. In this space, silence is not peaceful, it is heavy, because this is where bodies come to rest, and where a very specific kind of craftsman performs his work. Not a priest, not a healer, a mummy maker. Too many mummification evokes images of mysticism and gold, but the reality was anything but glorious. The process began with death inevitable, ever-present, and from there, it became a series of careful, grim tasks. First, the body had to be purified, washed, stripped. Then, the real labor began. The brain, considered useless, was removed through the nose. The tools were thin and hooked, designed not for elegance but for effectiveness. Organs were extracted and placed into jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The heart, often believed to house the soul, might be returned or might be replaced with a stone amulet, depending on the family's beliefs or wealth. Then came the drying. The body was covered in natron, a mineral salt, for 40 days. During this time, the air would fill with a pungent, bitter aroma, a blend of desiccation and decay. Mummy makers grew used to it. Their clothes absorbed it. Their hands were stained by it. The room had no windows. Once dried, the body was rubbed with oils. Resin was applied, linen wrappings, layer after layer, each one a ritual. Amulets placed at specific points, spells whispered or chanted, though perhaps half-heartedly when repeated for the 100th time that year. This was not holy work for most. It was a trade, often passed down through families. Apprentices learned by watching, by doing. They grew accustomed to silence, to the weight of expectation. And yet, mistakes had consequences. A tear in the skin, a misstep in the ritual. If discovered, the blame could bring disgrace or worse. Outside, life went on. Markets buzzed. Temples rang with chants. But the mummy maker's world remained quiet, hidden, and pungent. He might return home to a modest house, eat coarse bread and onions, and rise again at dawn to face another lifeless body. Some mummy makers believed deeply in what they did. Others simply needed to eat. They lived near They rose early, worked in the heat, avoided the gaze of the more pious classes. Their work was necessary, but not revered. Essential, but rarely honored. And still, the process went on. Centuries passed. The dead continued to arrive. Some rich, some poor, all equal. Eventually, beneath linen and resin, they might have believed they were preserving a soul's journey into eternity. But for the mummy maker, it was another day, another corpse, another chance to make a mistake that might linger for thousands of years. Tools were reused, oils were rationed. Not every family could afford the full rite. There were cheap mummification shortcuts and omissions. Some corpses were barely preserved, packed in resin-soaked linen, skipped steps, and silent prayers. And still, for the craftsman, this was daily life. He knew the difference between a rich man's embalming and a pauper's send-off. He adjusted, adapted, learned to do more with less, until death became a pattern. So as you lie still, imagining the quiet rustle of linen, the crackle of salt, and the flickering torchlight in the tomb, you begin to understand. To be a mummy maker was to walk daily with death not as a poet or a philosopher, but as a laborer, with cracked hands, with patience, and with no escape from the weight of eternity. Now, let us step into a different chamber. Brighter, higher, the Temple of Deir el-Bahari. Cut into the cliffs across from Thebes. Here, the colonnades rise in perfect symmetry. Carvings show a pharaoh in full regalia. But look closer. This pharaoh has soft cheeks, a slender frame, and no beard, at least. Not always. This is Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled as king, who wore the crown, gave orders, led armies, and built monuments to eternity, and then, after death, was erased, her name chiseled away. her image defaced. A disappearance not of the body but of memory. She was born into privilege. The daughter of Thutmose I. Her early life was shaped by courtly rituals and divine lineage. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II, and when he died young, their son Thutmose III was still a child. Hatshepsut became regent, expected to govern until the boy came of age, but she did not step aside. Instead, she stepped forward, quietly at first. Her images still showed her as a queen. Then, gradually, they changed. She adopted the iconography of kingship. She wore the Nine's headdress, the false beard. She took on the full royal titulari 5 names, just like any male pharaoh. Official records began to refer to her as His Majesty. It was unprecedented. Yet she was careful. She did not imprison Thutmose III. He remained a figure in the background, eventually becoming commander of the army. But the rule was hers. And under her, Egypt prospered. Trade flourished. One of her greatest achievements was the expedition to the land of Punt. Ships set sail from the Red Sea, returning with incense trees, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. On the temple walls, scenes of this voyage still stand detailed, vibrant, almost lively. It was not war she was known for, but diplomacy, architecture, and wealth. Her mortuary temple, built at Deir el, stands as one of the architectural wonders of ancient Egypt. Tiered, elegant, symmetrical, covered in scenes of divine birth and royal legitimacy. A queen who claimed she was chosen by the gods themselves. And yet, not long after her death, the erasure began. Statues were toppled, reliefs chipped away. Her name was scraped from cartouches. In official king lists, she was omitted. Later, scribes wrote as though she had never ruled. Why? For years, historians believed it was revenge Thutmose III finally asserting himself. But newer theories suggest something more bureaucratic. Perhaps her reign complicated the royal narrative. Perhaps male succession needed to appear unbroken. Still, her legacy lingered. Fragments of her statues remained buried, waiting. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists began to piece her story together. Her mummy, lost 4 centuries, was finally identified in 2007, matched by a single tooth found in a box inscribed with her name, a molar that fit perfectly into a jaw. Silent testimony. She had disappeared twice. First, her body misplaced, hidden in the sands of time. Then, her story intentionally wiped from stone. But both came back, unearthed by patient hands, curious minds, and time. So now, as you imagine the desert winds brushing against limestone columns, think of her, a ruler in a man's world. Unprecedented, powerful, erased but not forgotten. Her temple still catches the light each morning. Her statues, even broken, still gaze forward. Stone remembered, even when humans forget. Imagine the heat radiating from the cliffs of Western Thebes. The air is dry and still, except for the faint call of birds and the occasional whisper of wind through the wadis. Before you, carved deep into the limestone, is a valley barren, lifeless, and yet filled with the echoes of kings. This is the Valley of the Kings, a place where the dead do not sleep in silence. They wait. For centuries, this valley served as the royal burial ground of Egypt's new kingdom. Between the 16th and 11th centuries BC, it was the chosen final resting place for pharaohs, nobles, and favored elites. But this wasn't a place of grief, it was a gateway. Tombs here were not designed as graves. They were machines for eternity, carved deep into the stone, sometimes hundreds of feet inward. The tombs followed a sacred architectural formula. Corridors descending into darkness, decorated with hieroglyphs and sacred texts. These were not mere decorations. They were spelled safeguards for the soul. The dead king, it was believed, would need guidance through the Duat, the shadowy realm of the afterlife, filled with serpents, lakes of fire, and judgment halls. The walls of his tomb were a map, the inscriptions, his instructions. When Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, it wasn't the gold that held scholars' attention, it was the sealed doorway, the untouched thresholds, and the suggestion that even in the smallest tombs, there might still be untouched knowledge buried beneath layers of stone and sand. And so, the search never truly stopped. Over the past century, more chambers have been found, some grand, others humble. In 2005, KV-63 was unearthed a strange, undecorated chamber containing no body, only jars of embalming materials, natron, resin, as if someone had prepared for a burial that never came. Scholars still debate its purpose. Was it a storage room for nearby tombs? A hurried preparation chamber in times of crisis? Each new discovery seems to pose more questions than it answers. Consider Cavite 5, once thought insignificant, but deeper excavation revealed it as the largest tomb ever found in the valley, over 120 chambers, possibly intended for the sons of Ramses II. Its corridors twist and tangle, more like a labyrinth than a royal vault. Many rooms remain unexplored due to debris and instability. The deeper the tomb goes, the more fragile it becomes. And the mysteries don't end there. Recent radar scans beneath this tomb suggest the presence of hidden void-sealed rooms that may have once housed Queen Nefertiti. The data is inconclusive, the debate ongoing. Some scholars now believe the valley itself may be larger than we think. There may be side valleys, buried tombs, and unopened chambers hiding beneath centuries of erosion and collapse. But excavation must move slowly. The balance between discovery and preservation is delicate. Tombs collapse. Paint fades. Once air and light enter, the clock begins to tick. And yet the valley waits. It does not forget. Every so often, a small anomaly is found. A depression in the earth. A strange angle in the bedrock. A set of tools from modern thieves or ancient ones. All suggesting that this silent place still holds secrets just out of reach. The tombs themselves speak in symbols and silences. The Book of Gates. The Book of the Heavenly Cow. Star charts painted on ceilings. Images of the king merging with Osiris, rising reborn with the sun. But these aren't just for show, they are architecture of belief, of fear, of control over the uncontrollable, death itself. And above these tombs, the living once walked. Workmen from the nearby village of Deir el Medina, whose lives were bound to the valley. They climbed T as we peer. And now, as you imagine descending those steps, each one deeper into silence, picture the sealed doors yet unopened, the chambers still unknown. The dreams of key here, in this narrow valley. Time collapses. The living walk beside the dead. The known brushes against the forgotten. And the doors remain closed, not out of malice, but mystery. Not all, not yet. Imagine, for a moment, a great stone hall. The torches flicker against pillars carved with lotus and papyrus. Outside, the sun dips behind the Nile's western bank. Inside, long tables are being prepared, not with chairs, but with low stools and mats. Servants move quietly, balancing platters. The aroma of roasted goose and coriander wafts through the air. To dine like a pharaoh was to taste luxury in ritual form. It wasn't simply about satisfying hunger. Meals were expressions of status, ceremony, and cosmic balance. Bread formed the foundation, not soft, airy loaves, but dense, gritty, rounds often mixed with barley, emmer wheat, sometimes even sand from rough grinding stones. These were baked in conical molds, then piled high in baskets. With bread came beer, thick, cloudy, and mildly alcoholic, brewed from fermented barley, sweetened with dates. It was drunk from wide cups, and consumed by everyone from farmers to royalty. But the tables of pharaohs held much more. There were lentils, leeks, cucumbers, figs, and honey. Ducks and geese, salted or freshly roasted. Fish from the Nile, grilled with garlic and dill. Occasionally, beef or wild game, symbols of power and prestige. Honey cakes were a delicacy, golden, fragrant, spiced with cinnamon if imported. Fruits, both fresh and dried, adorned ceramic dishes. Pomegranates, grapes, and dom palm nuts provided bursts of sweetness between savory bites. And yet, not all was indulgent. Meals, especially those linked to religious feasts, followed protocol. Certain foods were forbidden at certain times. Offerings to the gods were prepared first, placed on altars, or buried with the dead. The priestly class, too, had dietary codes. Purity mattered. They might abstain from fish entirely, considering it unclean. In temples, food became part of ritual cycles, prepared by sacred cooks, who followed inherited procedures passed down for generations. At banquets, music and poetry filled the air. Harpists played soft tunes, and singers chanted verses praising the pharaoh or invoking the gods. Wine flowed freely, especially red wine, prized and imported from the Levant. Drunkenness, in moderation, was not frowned upon. It was even seen as divine when tied to certain goddesses like Hathor. Servants moved discreetly, offering scented oils for guests to anoint themselves. Perfume cones melted on the heads of diners, releasing fragrance throughout the evening. Dancers performed with slow, graceful gestures. The rhythm was everything in harmony. Even in death, dining mattered. Tombs were painted with scenes of banquets, steely listed menus for the afterlife. It was believed the dead could partake in these eternal meals through ritual offerings made by the living. So as you close your eyes, imagine the texture of stone beneath your fingers, the coolness of the floor, the flicker of light against carved hieroglyphs. Imagine the quiet clink of pottery, the soft hum of song, the scent of roast fowl and honeyed bread. To dine like a pharaoh was not simply to eat, it was to join in the rhythm of ritual, to affirm your place in the cosmos, and to taste, if only briefly, something eternal. Imagine standing on the deck of a royal barge, the Nile shimmering beneath the hull, oars dipping in unison, perfume sails catch the breeze. Music drifts over the water. At the center stands a queen, not in gold, not in armor, but wrapped in linen, wearing the diadem of Isis. This is Cleopatra, but not the Cleopatra of Roman poets or Hollywood. This is the last pharaoh of Egypt, walking a tightrope between worlds. Cleopatra, the seventh Philippita, was born into a crumbling dynasty. The Ptolemies, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but their kingdom was fractured. Internal conflict, corruption, and growing Roman interference had turned Egypt from an empire into a pawn. And yet Cleopatra was not a pawn. She was sharp, educated, and multilingual, speaking Greek, Egyptian, and likely several other languages. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. She was the first in her line to actively embrace Egyptian culture. Earlier Ptolemies ruled as outsiders. She ruled as one of them. Statues depict her in the style of Isis, merging divine and royal imagery. She participated in native rituals, issued decrees in Egyptian. To her people, she was more than a queen. She was a protector of math, the balance of the world. But outside Egypt, a different story was told. To the Romans, she was seductive, cunning, a manipulator. Roman writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius painted her as a temptress who ensnared great men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But these portraits served a purpose. By casting her as the foreign danger, Rome justified its conquests. Cleopatra became a symbol not of power, but of threat. In truth, her alliances with Caesar and Antony were strategic. With Caesar, she secured her throne during a civil war with her brother. With Antony, she forged a political and military union against Octavian, who would later become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. These were not mere affairs, they were calculated moves to preserve Egypt's independence. She bore children with both men, Caesarion with Julius Caesar, twins, and another son with Antony. For a time, it seemed Egypt might rise again, anchored by alliances, protected by fleets, but it was not to last. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated. Rome would not tolerate a rival power, especially not one led by a woman. Retreating to Egypt, the couple faced the end. Antony, misled into thinking Cleopatra had died, took his own life. Cleopatra, shortly after, followed perhaps by poison, perhaps by snakebite. We still don't know for certain. Her death marked the end of over 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Egypt became a Roman province. Caesarion was executed. The temples grew quiet, and yet her story did not fade. Over centuries, Cleopatra was reinvented again and again. In Renaissance art, she became a tragic heroine. In film, a femme fatale. But the truth, as always, is more complex. She was not simply a lover or a queen. She was a scholar, a strategist, a survivor. Coins bearing her image show a strong nose, a sharp chin knot, the idealized beauty of legend. But it was her intellect, not her appearance, that shaped empires. Today, her legacy is being re-examined. Historians dig beneath the layers of Roman bias, seeking the real woman behind the myth, a ruler who defied expectations, who tried, against impossible odds, to steer her nation through a storm. So, as you imagine the Nile at twilight, the scent of lotus drifting on the water, remember her not just as a queen who fell, but as one who dared to rule in a world not made for her. She did not lose because she was weak. She lost because she stood alone against an empire. And still, her name endures. Picture a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Silent, sealed, painted walls shimmer faintly in torchlight, depicting golden boats and jackal-headed gods. The sarcophagus rests undisturbed, or so you think. But this wasn't just a sacred space. It was a vault. And vaults attract thieves. The ancient Egyptians believed in the afterlife not as an abstract paradise, but as a lived material continuation of Earth. A soul needed food, tools, amulets, even furniture. Tombs were stocked like miniature homes. The wealthier the deceased, the more lavish the burial. And therein lay the problem. Wealth, buried under sand, unguarded. Tomb robbery wasn't it? A modern crime. It was a concern, even while the tombs were still being built. In fact, many tombs were robbed within decades, sometimes even years of burial. Pharaohs tried to defend against it. Curses were inscribed, passages hidden, fake chambers constructed, but nothing truly stopped the most determined thieves. The Theban necropolis became a battlefield of silence between preservation and plunder. We know this not just from archaeology, but from paperwork. In the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE, Egypt was crumbling. Tomb robberies skyrocketed, and the government responded not with priests, but with papyri, like the Abbott Papyrus and the Amherst. Papyrus revealed investigations into tomb break-in. Officials inspected graves, questioned stonecutters, interrogated guards. One document records a robbery in which the perpetrators were caught and confessed in detail. They described breaking through the limestone, lighting lamps, rifling through amulets, melting down gold. It wasn't always outsiders. Often, the robbers were insiders, laborers who had helped build the tombs, or priests desperate during economic collapse. They knew the layouts, the weak spots, what was worth taking. Punishments were brutal. Amputation, impalement, in some cases, execution. But theft persisted, especially during periods of drought, famine, or political upheaval. To prevent this, some high priests took drastic measures. Mummies of former kings Ramesses II, and others were secretly relocated to hidden caches like the Deir el-Bahri tomb. Here, wrapped in anonymity, royalty lay hidden for centuries. But even these emergency moves were temporary. Almost no tomb in Egypt remained untouched. What makes this more fascinating is how economic the afterlife had become. There were entire industries around burial: carpenters for coffins, artists for wall scenes, embalmers, linen weavers, amulet makers, papyrus scribes. A middle-class Egyptian might spend years saving for burial expenses, purchasing spells from the Book of the Dead like buying insurance. You could buy better quality mummification, or even hire priests to say your name in rituals for decades after death, known as the cult of the dead. And if your family stopped paying, the rituals stopped. Your presence in the afterlife weakened. Even in death, it seemed, you could go bankrupt. So people worried. They left curses behind, spells threatening intruders with blindness, madness, or divine vengeance. One reads, "Anyone who disturbs this tomb, may the crocodile be against him in the water, the snake against him on land, and the hippopotamus upon him in the river." It wasn't just drama, it was deterrence, and perhaps a little desperation. Some tomb owners took it even further. They employed ghost audits, rituals in which priests summoned the BA of the deceased to question them. Was the burial proper? Were the offerings sufficient? Was anything missing? If a mistake was uncovered, repairs were made, sometimes decades after burial. A damaged spell might be an offering reperformed. The dead were watching and occasionally speaking. And yet, despite all of this, the tombs were still plundered. The gold was melted down. The names of some kings vanished. Only a few tombs like Tutankhamun's, protected by flood debris, escaped untouched. But perhaps, ironically, it's the robbers who ensured that we remember. In searching for treasure, they left trails, broken seals, abandoned tools. And through modern excavation, we follow those same trails, not to steal but to understand. So as you walk through a reconstructed tomb in your imagination, imagine not just the dead king lying still in his sarcophagus, but the whispers in the dark, the scraping of chisels, the rush of feet in forbidden chambers. The afterlife was supposed to be eternal, but even eternity had a black market. Picture a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Silent, sealed, painted walls shimmer faintly in torchlight, depicting golden boats and jackal-headed gods. The sarcophagus rests undisturbed, or so you think. But this wasn't just a sacred space, it was a vault. And vaults attract thieves. The ancient Egyptians believed in the afterlife not as an abstract paradise, but as a lived material continuation of Earth. A soul needed food, tools, amulets, even furniture. Tombs were stocked like miniature homes. The wealthier the deceased, the more lavish the burial. And therein lay the problem. Wealth, buried under sand, unguarded. Tomb robbery wasn't a modern crime. It was a concern, even while the tombs were still being built. In fact, many tombs were robbed within decades, sometimes even years of burial. Pharaohs tried to defend against it. Curses were inscribed, passages hidden, fake chambers constructed, but nothing truly stopped the most determined thieves. The Theban necropolis became a battlefield of silence between preservation and plunder. We know this not just from archaeology, but from paperwork. In the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE, Egypt was crumbling. Tomb robberies skyrocketed, and the government responded not with priests, but with papyri, like the Abbott Papyrus and the Amherst. Papyrus revealed investigations into tomb break-in. Officials inspected graves, questioned stonecutters, interrogated guards. One document records a robbery in which the perpetrators were caught and confessed in detail. They described breaking through the limestone, lighting lamps, rifling through amulets, melting down gold. It wasn't always outsiders. Often, the robbers were insiders, laborers who had helped build the tombs, or priests desperate during economic collapse. They knew the layouts, the weak spots, what was worth taking. Punishments were brutal. Amputation, impalement, in some cases, execution. But theft persisted, especially during periods of drought, famine, or political upheaval. To prevent this, some high priests took drastic measures. Mummies of former kings Ramesses II, and others were secretly relocated to hidden caches like the Deir el-Bahri tomb. Here, wrapped in anonymity, royalty lay hidden for centuries. But even these emergency moves were temporary. Almost no tomb in Egypt remained untouched. What makes this more fascinating is how economic the afterlife had become. There were entire industries around burial: carpenters for coffins, artists for wall scenes, embalmers, linen weavers, amulet makers, papyrus scribes. A middle-class Egyptian might spend years saving for burial expenses, purchasing spells from the Book of the Dead like buying insurance. You could buy better quality mummification, or even hire priests to say your name in rituals for decades after death, known as the cult of the dead. And if your family stopped paying, the rituals stopped. Your presence in the afterlife weakened. Even in death, it seemed, you could go bankrupt. So people worried. They left curses behind, spells threatening intruders with blindness, madness, or divine vengeance. One reads, "Anyone who disturbs this tomb, may the crocodile be against him in the water, the snake against him on land, and the hippopotamus upon him in the river." It wasn't just drama, it was deterrence. And perhaps a little desperation. Some tomb owners took it even further. They employed ghost audits, rituals in which priests summoned the ba of the deceased to question them. Was the burial proper? Were the offerings sufficient? Was anything missing? If a mistake was uncovered, repairs were made, sometimes decades after burial. A damaged spell might be an offering reperformed. The dead were watching and occasionally speaking. And yet, despite all of this, the tombs were still plundered. The gold was melted down. The names of some kings vanished. Only a few tombs like Tutankhamun's, protected by flood debris, escaped untouched. But perhaps, ironically, it's the robbers who ensured that we remember. In searching for treasure, they left trails, broken seals, abandoned tools. And through modern excavation, we follow those same trails, not to steal but to understand. So as you walk through a reconstructed tomb in your imagination, imagine not just the dead king lying still in his sarcophagus, but the whispers in the dark, the scraping of chisels, the rush of feet in forbidden chambers. The afterlife was supposed to be eternal, but even eternity had a black market. Now, let your thoughts drift to the stillness of a royal tomb. Deep beneath the desert, silence presses in like the weight of stone. Walls shimmer faintly with painted gods and sacred spells. The air is dry, ancient, and nearly motionless. But this tomb, so carefully sealed, so ritually protected, was not always undisturbed. Because not long after the last worker chipped his final hieroglyph, ... someone came back. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt was not a rare crime. It was an industry. Despite the immense effort Egyptians put into securing their dead traps, hidden corridors, curses etched into stone, most tombs, especially those of the wealthy, were eventually broken into. Gold, jewels, ritual vessels, even oils and linens, all were valuable. The dead, for all their preparation, could not protect what they left behind. The robbers came at night. Often they were locals, men who had once helped build the tombs, or whose fathers had. They knew the passageways, They knew the weak points. Sometimes they tunneled in. Sometimes they bribed guards. Sometimes ... they were the gods. Inside, the work was swift and chaotic. They might smash their way into sarcophagi, tear apart mummies in search of amulets, strip gold leaf from statues. Candles flickered in the still air, illuminating acts that went beyond theft. They disrupted the journey of the soul. And yet, it happened again and again. Some robbers were caught. Legal records from the 20th dynasty detail confessions, trials, tortures. In one famous case, several men admitted to looting the tomb of Queen Isis. They described in grim detail how they unwrapped the body, stole her jewelry, and left her remains behind. Tossed aside, the court scribes wrote it all down, line by line. But the motivation was often simple. Survival. In a country where famine could strike unexpectedly, where taxes were heavy and kings distant, the wealth of the dead seemed too tempting to ignore. There was also a black market. Items stolen from tombs could be melted down, recut, or even sold to temple officials looking to fund their own rituals. Some relics made their way north, traded for cedar or lapis lazuli. Others stayed close, hidden beneath floorboards, or tucked into family shrines. By the later periods of Egyptian history, even the state itself began to repurpose tombs. Old coffins were reused. Mummies. In the vast necropolis of Thebes, certain royal bodies were hidden in secret caches by priests, not to preserve them forever, but to protect them from looting. These caches, such as the famous DB320, contained dozens of pharaohs, all reburied in haste, stripped of finery but preserved in name. And still, the robbers came. In modern times, the black market persists in new forms. Grave goods smuggled out of Egypt, sometimes sold in shadowy corners of museums or private collections. Every year, archaeologists and officials attempt to trace and recover looted artifacts. Some are returned. And so, as you imagine the quiet corridor of a tomb, with dust drifting through a broken seal, you begin to see the long shadow cast by greed. Even in death, the ancient Egyptians could not escape the reach of the living. Stone doors were meant to last forever, but forever, as it turns out, is fragile. So lie still now. Picture the torchlight moving across a golden mask, a hand trembling as it reaches out, not in reverence, but in theft. And imagine the silence that follows. Not peaceful, but hollow. A silence that knows it has been broken. Step away from the palaces and temples now. Leave behind the gold of Tutankhamun, the towering columns of Karnak, the grand tombs of the pharaohs. Walk instead into a humble village along the Nile. Mud brick homes. Chickens dart between doorways. Children chase dogs. Bread bakes in outdoor ovens. And behind these simple scenes is an entire world of unseen forces. Because for the average Egyptian, life was never just physical. It was spiritual. Every moment, every illness, every shadow in the corner had meaning. The gods of Egypt weren't distant. They weren't confined to grand statues or temple rituals. They were everywhere. In the wind, in the river, in the fields, and so were the other forces, spirits, ghosts, demons, invisible presences that could help or harm. Ordinary people didn't read from the Book of the Dead. That was for the wealthy. Instead, they relied on local magic, oral tradition, and small, potent rituals passed from parent to child. Protection spells were scratched onto pottery shards. Amulets were worn against the evil eye. Mothers whispered incantations over sick children. Farmers spoke blessings over their crops, hoping for mercy from both gods and pests. Illness was rarely just illness. A stomachache might mean possession. A fever could signal a spirit's anger. Priests might help, but so might a wise woman, or a village healer, who knew the right herbs and the right prayers. Household gods were central. Chief among them, Besesquat, lion-faced, dwarf, with a tongue out and a knife in hand. Ugly by divine standards, but beloved. He protected families, women in childbirth, and homes from evil spirits. Statues of Base stood by beds, painted on walls, carved into mirrors. He was the last face a child might see before sleep. Then there was Toaret, the hippogoddess, often shown pregnant. She guarded expectant mothers, scaring off malevolent forces that might steal the life of a newborn. For people without modern medicine, childbirth was secret and terrifying. So Toaret was everywhere, carved into amulets, painted on cups, etched into furniture. Dreams were powerful. Egyptians believed the soul could wander at night, receiving messages or warnings. Temples sometimes offered dream interpretation services. Certain gods like Serapis or Thoth might visit in dreams to guide or heal. Magic wasn't superstition, it was a divine force. Even the gods used it. Ordinary Egyptians used it too, blending religion with there were love spells, revenge spells, curses scratched onto lead tablets and thrown into canals. There were fertility rituals, binding charms, and protective texts buried beneath thresholds. And not all spirits were friendly. The Aku, or blessed dead, could be petitioned for help like divine ancestors, but others or bower wrestlers, angry dead. They could haunt, torment, even bring death. Some spells specifically targeted them, demanding peace or banishment. Demons, too, had names. Amit, the devourer of souls, waited in the underworld to eat the hearts of the wicked. But others roamed the earth, serpentine, canine, or shadow-shaped beings who could cause madness or drought. They were not always evil, but they were always dangerous. To guard against them, Egyptians used ritual. A child might wear a string of beads for protection. A doorway might be painted with red ochre and blessed water. Farmers might bury figurines in fields to ensure good harvests. Even the layout of homes could reflect spiritual concerns, niches for offerings, protective idols near entrances, and doorways facing auspicious directions. And when death came, the beliefs though not everyone could afford full mummification, even the poorest hoped for passage into the afterlife. They might be buried with simple charms or a single spell, a small figure of a siren, a prayer for safe passage. The soul, after all, had to face trials, face judges, speak the negative confession, and navigate the perils of the duat. So as you picture that modest home along the Nile, sunlight filtering through woven mats, the smell of onions and bread in the air, remember that its inhabitants lived surrounded by the unseen. They tried to control it with whatever tools they had. Not priests, not kings, just people. Their magic wasn't flashy. It was worn into the skin, whispered before sleep, drawn in chalk, placed under pillows, because for them, survival wasn't just about food or water, it was about balance, between the seen and the unseen, between gods and ghosts, between this life and whatever came next. The sands are almost out of time. The pyramids still stand, but they are ancient ruins now. The pharaohs are long gone, their names eroded. Rome is rising, and Egypt once, the beating heart of the ancient world, is in its final act. At the center of that stage stands a woman, a queen, a pharaoh, and a myth that has outlived all others. Cleopatra the Seventh. But who was she? Forget, for a moment, what Hollywood told you. Forget the sultry glances, the aspie in the basket, the lavish seduction of Roman generals. That Cleopatra was born not of history, but of propaganda. The real Cleopatra was brilliant, strategic, and fluent in at least 9 languages. The first of her dynasty descended from Macedonian Greeks who speak Egyptian fluently. She wasn't merely a beauty, she was a ruler, one raised in a royal house soaked in politics, betrayal, and survival. Her world was falling apart when she came to power. The Ptolemaic dynasty, started by one of Alexander the Great's generals, had been ruling Egypt for nearly 300 years. But by Cleopatra's time, it was collapsing. Rome loomed like a tidal wave, swallowing kingdoms one by one. She was 18 when she became co-ruler with her younger brother. Within a few years, she was exiled. Then came the moment that would change everything. Enter Julius Caesar. Cleopatra didn't arrive to meet him with desperation, she arrived in style and strategy. Legend says she had herself smuggled into his chambers in a rug or linen sack, unrolled before him, dazzling and unbent. Whether or not that story is true, what followed is fact. Caesar supported her claim to the throne. She returned to power, and later, she bore him a son. Their relationship was not just romantic, it was political. Egypt needed Rome. Cleopatra knew this. She used intelligence, diplomacy, and personal charisma to protect her country's sovereignty. For a while, but Caesar's assassination changed everything. Rome descended into chaos, and Cleopatra, once again, played her hand with care. This time, it was Mark Antonia, Roman general, powerful and ambitious. Their alliance was both passionate and pragmatic. Together, they ruled the Eastern Mediterranean, presenting themselves as a new Isis and Osiris. Their children bore royal titles. Egypt thrived. Temples were restored. Trade flourished. But Rome did not approve. The Western world, led by Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, declared war, not just on Antony, but But on Cleopatra, Roman propaganda painted her as a seductress, a foreign threat, a queen who had ensnared a Roman hero and threatened the values of the Republic. It worked. The story stuck. And when the war ended in disaster, when Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra followed with her own legendary suicide, the victors erased the nuance. Octavian paraded her image through the streets of Rome, not as a powerful ruler who held the empire at bay for decades, but as a cautionary tale. And yet, Cleopatra endured. Centuries passed. Myths layered over facts. Writers turned her into a symbol of beauty, of danger, of feminine power, of downfall. Shakespeare made her tragic. Hollywood made her seductive. But history remembers something more complex. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who ruled as a god queen in a world designed for men, who held the line against Rome not with armies alone, but with wit, diplomacy, and determination. She was not Egyptian by blood, but she became Egypt in spirit. She aligned herself with its gods, its people, its identity. She walked through temples in full regalia. She minted coins with her own face. She ruled, not just reigned. So as the sun finally sets on this long journey through ancient Egypt, remember her, not as the woman with the ASP or the lover of Romans, but as the last voice of a civilization drowned, not in scandal but in empire. A queen whose true power wasn't in her beauty, but in how long we've tried to understand her. Let's walk, now, away from the shadows of tombs, and into the blinding sun of the Giza Plateau. The pyramids rise ahead, colossal, precise, eternal. They look like the work of gods, or of slaves. But that last idea, it's wrong. Archaeologists have uncovered enough to dispel that myth. In 1990, near the pyramids, they found the workers' village. Rows of modest homes, bakeries, breweries, even medical facilities. Graffiti scratched into limestone walls joked about crew names. The drunkards of Menkaure. These men had names, crews, pride. But that doesn't mean life was easy. Most pyramid workers were part of a rotating labor force, conscripted from villages across Egypt 4 months at a time. They were fed, housed, and even buried near the monuments they built. But their lives were defined by repetition. Stone, sand, sweat, start at dawn. The sun, already hot. Haul limestone blocks, some weighing over a ton. Up ramps across. The wooden sled digs grooves into the desert floor. Your sandals break. You keep moving. Bread soaked in beer. A few dried figs. Maybe salted fish if you're lucky. And then back to work. Some were skilled artisans, stone cutters, plasterers, painters, crafting chambers you'd never live in. But most were laborers anonymous. Bones from workers' graves show crushed vertebrae, arthritis, broken limbs, signs of strain. Some were treated, others weren't. And still, the project continued. Decades, entire lives spent on one monument. You might never see the capstone placed. You just knew your village owed men, and that it was your turn. But it wasn't slavery. This was labor, a civic duty, a tax, paid in muscle. Your family might send bread or clothing to support you. You might take pride in your part. After all, the pharaoh was divine. Building for him meant building the cosmic order. Even so, the work broke people. Imagine working in the stone quarries of Tura, under torchlight in narrow shafts, carving limestone blocks by hand, breathing in dust, lifting endlessly. You return home months later with a limp and a cough. Or worse, you don't return. Your grave is shallow, marked only by a potsherd with your name. And what about the architects? They carried a different burden. Precision. The pyramid had to align with stars, with cardinal direction, with the ancient math of mat, balance, and harmony. Mistakes weren't tolerated. A misaligned chamber meant catastrophe, collapse, dishonor. So these weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They were laborers in a nation of rituals, where even building was sacred, where sweat was part of worship, where you traded freedom for participation in something grander, something that would outlive you. The pyramid was never about the individual, not you, not even the pharaoh. It was about permanence. And so, you carried stone, you hauled, you died, and someone else took your place. The pyramid rose, and you disappeared into the sand beneath it. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture not a tomb, not a temple, but a small, clay-walled room near the Nile. The sun glints off jars lined neatly on wooden shelves. The smell is strange, part sweet, part sour. In the corner, A man, his leg is swollen, his breath short. This is an Egyptian healing house, and you're about to witness medicine 3,000 years before modern science. The physician steps forward, not in a white coat, but in linen, with a reed pen tucked behind his ear. He is called Ayest. He speaks in half words, half spells, because healing in ancient Egypt was never just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, cosmic. Illness was a disruption, a tear in the order of man. And to restore it, you needed more than herbs. You needed balance. You needed the gods. But they weren't guessing. The Egyptians were some of the earliest anatomists. They knew the pulse. They catalogued over 700 remedies in scrolls like the Ebers. They recognized symptoms, diagnosed infections, set broken bones. They had tools, copper scalpels, forceps, probes, and they had treatments. Let's talk about those. Honey, Egypt's golden medicine, used on wounds for its antimicrobial properties. We know now it actually works. Willow bark, for pain. It contains salicin, like modern aspirin. Garlic and onions, to stimulate vitality, prescribed for heart problems and general strength. But then, there were the stranger things. Crocodile dung, mixed with sour milk and inserted as a contraceptive. Lizard blood, mashed scarabs, donkey hooves, even ground up mummy powder. Yes, real powdered mummies, sold later as a cure. Not all treatments were medical. Some were magical. Spells were amulets tied around limbs. Illness was often blamed on malevolent spirits, or the gods themselves. A toothache might be caused by a demon gnawing your gums. A seizure, perhaps possession by an angry spirit. The solution: speak a spell, burn incense, press herbs, and wait. Yet, despite all this, Egyptian medicine worked surprisingly well. They performed surgeries, drained abscesses, treated cataracts with copper needles. They knew to clean injuries, apply pressure, and avoid contamination, even if they didn't know why. Women had specialized healers. There were midwives, fertility rituals, pregnancy tests involving barley and emmer wheat. Urinate on seeds. If they sprout, you're pregnant. It sounds absurd, but modern science shows that hormone changes can indeed affect seed growth. Still, their understanding of internal organs was limited. They believed the heart was the center of thought, the brain, removed during mummification, considered useless. But their success wasn't just in the body, it was in care, because illness wasn't just a defect, it was a story, a disruption in the sacred rhythm, and healing was the act of rewriting that story, realigning the soul with the body with the gods. Physicians traveled, some became legendary, like Imhotep, the architect of the first pyramid, later worshipped as a god of medicine. Others faded into anonymity. Temple doctors, village women whispering prayers over bowls of crushed herbs. And so, imagine now, the quiet hum of bees, the soft crackle of burning myrrh, the careful stir of a reed in honey, a mother clutching her child, a healer dipping a cloth, a chant rising gently in the heat. This was medicine, not sterile, not precise, but deeply human. And in that small room by the Nile, healing was not just an act of science. It was faith and ritual, and the oldest kind of hope. Step out of the tombs, out of the temples. The sun is sharp again, the sky cloudless. The market hums, fabrics ripple in the wind, perfume lingers in the air. This is a world of sand and heat. And yet, the people here are styled, polished, and deliberate in every thread and pigment. Fashion in ancient Egypt was not just about beauty. It was identity, rank, ritual, even hygiene. Let's start with the fabric you saw everywhere. Linen, spun from flax, bleached in the sun, and woven into cloth so fine it could be nearly transparent. The elite wore pleated kilts and long gowns, almost weightless. The poor wore coarser versions, still linen, but stiffer, simpler. In this desert land, linen was both luxury and necessity. It breathed, it shimmered in torchlight, it soaked up sweat, and for the pharaoh, it was divine. Woven just for him by temple workers under ritual purity. But clothing was only the beginning. Hair, that was an art form. Or rather, wigs were. Most people, especially the upper class, shaved their heads for cleanliness. The hot climate made lice and sweat a constant nuisance. Instead, they wore elaborate wigs, braided, curled, and perfumed. Wigs weren't just practical, they were status. A priest's wig was neat, shoulder length, symmetrical, voluminous, with beads, gold threads, or wax cones that melted slowly, releasing fragrance through the banquet. And then, makeup. For men and women alike, black coal rimmed the eyes, stretching into elegant points. Green malachites powdered the lids. These weren't just aesthetic choices. Coal reduced glare from the sun and protected against eye infections. It was beauty and medicine. Lips and cheeks were tinted with red ochre, fingernails painted with henna, scented oils rubbed on the skin after every bath. Mirrors were made of polished bronze, combs of ivory, cosmetics kept in tiny stone jars, beautifully carved. Perfume was everywhere. Frankincense, myrrh, lotus. Oils were worn like jewelry. Each scent could mark you as wealthy, pure, or divine. Even children were styled with care. Boys often had shaved heads with a single side lock of youth, a long braid indicating age and innocence. Girls might wear jewelry even in infancy. Anklets, earrings, tiny collars of beads. Now imagine royalty. A pharaoh appeared not just dressed, but transformed. His nin's headdress gleamed gold and blue, a ceremonial beard, fake, often tied beneath his chin. His chest bore a broad collar of turquoise, carnelian, and lapis lazuli. His sandals, sometimes made of gold-leafed leather, pressed into carpets of reeds or silk. And the queen's, majestic, precise. Nefertiti's bust still stuns us today. The perfect symmetry, the smooth brows, the crown like a lotus in bloom. Egyptian queens didn't dress to impress, they dressed to embody. Even in death, fashion mattered. The wealthy were buried with their finest wigs, makeup palettes, jewelry, and linens. Tomb paintings show idealized versions of themselves, eternally youthful, eternally styled. Because appearance wasn't vanity, it was a way to shape the kahar, to present yourself properly to gods, ancestors, and eternity. But what about the common people? Even the poor wore jewelry. Faience beads, shells, knotted cords, dyed red for protection. A girl in a farming village might own just one necklace, but she'd treasure it. An amulet of base to protect her child. A ring with a scarab for luck. They didn't have gold, but they had meaning. So next time you think of ancient Egypt, don't just picture pyramids and mummies. Picture fashion as power, makeup as medicine, wigs as armor. Even in the harshest desert, they found beauty. Even among hardship, they expressed identity. Style, to them, was sacred. And somehow, in the shimmering lines of coal, in the press of linen against skin, they reached across time to tell us, we were here. We were beautiful. We mattered. Close your eyes. The wind is soft across the Nile. In the distance, a slow, pulsing rhythm begins. Hollow drums, a high, reedy flute, the rattle of sis. Then footsteps, graceful, measured. A dancer enters the courtyard, arms raised, fingertips brushing the sky. This was Egypt's soul, music and movement. Not for entertainment alone, but for magic, healing, and worship. We often picture the ancient Egyptians as still, frozen in profile on tomb walls, but they were not still. Their world was alive with sound. It echoed in temples. It hummed through villages. It filled the halls of palaces and the depths of tombs. Let's begin with the instruments. Drums made from stretched animal skin, tight and earthy. Flutes carved from reeds, played sideways or straights, soft as whispered. Harpists plucked large, curved instruments strung with gut or fiber, their fingers dancing as delicately as the notes they released. And then came the sistra, sacred rattles made of metal or faience, shaped like an ankh or a house of the goddess Hathor. When shaken, they sang with a chime-like rhythm that was said to repel evil spirits. Temple priestesses used them in sacred rites. Never just noise, always intention. The minute, another ritual rattle, swung from necklaces or hands, its weight and jingle invoking divine protection. It was associated with Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and love. Trumpets, rare but powerful, announced kings and ceremonies. Clappers, made from ivory or wood shaped like hands, kept time during dance performances. The rhythm was everything, and music wasn't reserved for the elite. It flowed in street festivals, in births, in weddings, and funerals. In small villages, Mothers hummed lullabies. Workers sang, chanced, and matched the rhythm of rowing or harvest. Musicians wandered marketplaces, earning coin for a song or a blessing. And then there was dance. We know more about dance in ancient Egypt from art than words. Wall paintings show dances in motion, bending, leaping, spinning with grace. They weren't improvising. They were following choreographed forms passed down over generations. Women danced at banquets and temples, often in small groups, their limbs extended in smooth, expressive arcs. Some dancers were professionals, trained and hired by noble households or religious centers. Others were sacred performers, chosen for their roles in divine rituals. Dance could praise the gods, mourn the dead, or celebrate the seasons. Some dances involved acrobatics, backbends, handstands, sharp angles. Others were slow, ritualistic, almost trance-like. Attire mattered too. Dancers wore beads that shimmered and belts that jingled. Their movement wasn't just visual, it sounded. Some wore perfumes in cones that slowly melted, releasing scent through the performance. And through all of it, Hathor, the goddess of music, joy, intoxication, watched and inspired. Her temples were filled with musicians and dancers. Her festivals overflowed with sound and celebration, sometimes wild, sometimes reverent. Even funerals included music. Harpists played mourning songs as processions moved through the streets. Some tombs show singers and musicians leading the dead into the next world. A gentle transition. It wasn't background noise. It was essential. To make music was to bridge the worlds between people, between gods, between life and death. And music outlasted death. Musicians were buried with their instruments. Dancers were painted on tomb walls in the eternal act of movement. Lyrics of songs survived on papier. Even thousands of years later, we can hear echoes. In the rhythm of language, the beat of ceremonies, the silence that waits to be filled. So imagine now that sound. The rise and fall of flutes, the pulse of a drum, the shimmer of bronze clapper, and feet bare against polished stone, moving with the sun, the gods, the Nile. Music was never just sound. It was life itself, carried on a breeze, passed down in breath, and returned, always, to the rhythm of the earth. Now picture yourself in a small, shadowed room. A clay lamp flickers near the doorway. The scent of crushed herbs lingers in the air. On a woven mat lies a child, fevered, breathing fast. Over them, a healer mutters, words older than writing. One hand holds a reed pen, the other, a salve of honey and mold. This is Egyptian medicine. To live in ancient Egypt was to walk a narrow line between health and affliction, between magic and science. Illness was never just physical. It could come from bad air, spoiled food, a curse, or even a spiteful ghost. And so, healing had to address both body and spirit. Egyptians had doctors, real ones. They were called trained professionals who studied from scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus. These texts listed hundreds of remedies, ointments, diagnoses, even surgeries. There were doctors who specialized in the eyes, the stomach, the teeth. Yes, ancient Egypt had a classic remedy might include ground acacia seeds, mixed with honey, applied with linen. Another might call for crocodile dung. Some cures sound effective, others a little questionable, but all were tied to the belief that the body was sacred and vulnerable. Wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Fractures were set. Infections were treated with honey, which we now know is naturally antibacterial. Even moldy bread, used in poultices, may have worked like early antibiotics. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew that it worked. Still, no treatment was complete without magic. Egyptians believed illness could come from the will of the gods, the bite of demons, or the anger of ancestors. So physicians often worked with priests. A healer might write a protective spell, then fold it into a charm worn around the neck. They might recite hymns to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and healing, or appeal to Thoth, patron of knowledge. Amulets were everywhere. The Eye of Horus to ward off illness, the scarab for rebirth. Mothers tied protective charms to newborns' cribs. Farmers wore them during planting. Soldiers before battle. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Midwives were aided by magical wands carved with protective spirits. To ease labor, a woman might squat on a special birthing stool, as others chanted spells around her. After birth, the umbilical cord might be buried near the home, a gesture of protection for the child's life. And what about mental health? There were words for sorrow, fear, and even madness. Treatments often included ritual bathing, incense, and dream interpretation. The sick might sleep in temples, hoping for divine visions to guide their recovery. But despite all this knowledge, death still came. Life expectancy was low. A tooth abscess could kill. A fever could linger for weeks. Parasites, malnutrition, snake bites, infections. These were everyday threats. For the poor, especially, care was limited to folk remedies and prayers. Even pharaohs suffered. Mummies reveal arthritis, dental decay, bone infections. Ramses II, Egypt's great builder, had terrible teeth. Tutankhamun walked with a cane. Wealth brought comfort, but not immunity. Yet through it all, the Egyptians persisted. They learned. They recorded. Some scrolls include over 800 prescriptions for everything from hair loss to migraines. A blend of careful observation and spiritual belief, centuries ahead of their time. So now, as you sit beneath the imagined sun of ancient Egypt, consider this. Medicine was not separate from religion. Healing was not just physical. To treat illness, the Egyptians believed you needed knowledge, yes, but also respect for the unseen, for the forces that move through air, blood, and shadow. And so the healer's hand carried more than balm. It carried hope, written in ink, whispered in prayer, wrapped in linen, and passed from one fragile life to the next. Now imagine yourself walking through a narrow mountain pass. The cliffs of Thebes towering above you. The air is dry, the sun brutal. But here, in this secluded valley, something extraordinary is happening. Chisels ring out, dust rises, colors are mixed in, clay bowls. And deep within the rock, a workforce is building a gateway not to a palace, but to eternity. This is the business of death. Ancient Egypt's belief in the afterlife wasn't just spiritual. It shaped entire cities, economies, and generations of labor. And nowhere was this clearer than in the construction of royal tombs. From the grandeur of the pyramids to the hidden precision of the Valley of the Kings, the afterlife was an earned ditch. And behind every sacred chamber, every golden coffin, stood ordinary people. Craftsmen, stonecutters, painters, foremen, scribes. Most of them lived in a place called Deir el-Medina, a purpose-built village for the workers who carved and decorated the tombs of pharaohs, isolated between cliffs, guarded, and state-sponsored. This was home to one of the most skilled communities in Egypt. The workers were divided into two crews, left and right, each with specialized roles. Quarrymen who hacked passageways into bedrock, plasterers who smoothed the walls, painters and calligraphers who brought the dead's journey to life in vivid color, draftsmen who sketched the gods, the monsters, the spell, scribes who kept records of every hour, every tool, every absence. And yes, they had sick days. They were not slaves. These were paid, literate artisans, receiving monthly rations of grain, beer, oil, and meat. Some even left graffiti on tomb walls, jokes, complaints, or names scratched into stone like ancient signatures. Their work was secret, sacred, time-consuming. A royal tomb could take decades to complete. Every symbol had purpose. The books of the dead, of gates, of caverns, all painted in glowing yellows, deep blues, and fire red. The gods were everywhere. Osiris, Anubis, Ra in his solar bark. The pharaoh's soul was shown traveling through the underworld, fighting serpents, weighing his heart. Mistakes were not tolerated. If a figure was drawn wrong, it was covered and redone. If the pharaoh's name was spelled incorrectly, the consequences were cosmic. But not all projects were finished. If a king died young, as Tutankhamun did, the tomb might be rushed, shortened, painted in haste. Time was always the enemy. And yet, these workers knew death. They prepared for it constantly. Many of them built their own tombs, just outside Deir, modest, but carefully painted, filled with inscriptions, prayers, and love. These weren't the tombs of kings, but of craftsmen, men and women who knew that their brushstrokes and chisels helped guide souls into the afterlife. Their village was remarkably organized. We have lists of names, disputes over stolen food, even evidence of the first recorded labor strike in history, when their rations were delayed under Ramses III. The workers downed tools and marched to the temple to demand justice. They weren't just builders, they were people, with voices, with stories. Some scribes left letters full of gossip. My neighbor stole my cloak. A scorpion bit my child. One man even wrote love poems carefully penned on broken pottery shards. And when the tombs were finished, the doors were sealed. But the work wasn't over. Priests took over performing rituals, offering food, reciting spells. The dead had to be fed and honored to remain at peace. Tombs were not just built, they were maintained, a kind of spiritual upkeep. And all of this had to be funded. So behind the spiritual glow of the afterlife lay an economic machine. Nobles bought plots, artisans accepted commissions, workshops crafted coffins, amulets, priests offered packages of afterlife services. Even ordinary Egyptians scraped together what they could: simple burials, shared tombs, prayers carved into clay. In death, as in life, hierarchy persisted. The rich could afford eternity with all its gilded trappings. The poor had simpler hopes: a clean wrapping, a clay pot, a name remembered. But no one died alone in Egypt. Death employed thousands, sustained villages, preserved art, kept myths alive. So as you run your hand along an imagined wall painted with stars, jackals, and solar boats, remember, every inch was touched by human hands. Every figure of a god, every line of hieroglyphs, was carved by someone with calloused fingers and a family waiting at home. In a world obsessed with eternity, someone still had to mix the paint. Picture the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean lapping against the white stone docks of Alexandria. The air smells of salt, papyrus, and spiced wine. Ships from Rome, Syria, and Nubia crowd the harbor. Somewhere in the royal palace a woman leans over a map. She is not simply a queen. She is Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. To understand Cleopatra is to strip away the myths. She was not the temptress of legend, nor just a footnote in the stories of powerful Roman men. She was a ruler in her own right, intelligent, multilingual, politically astute, and perhaps the most skilled propagandist Egypt ever produced. Born in 69 BCE to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal line that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, Cleopatra VII was raised in a crumbling kingdom. Her ancestors spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and ruled from Greek-style palaces. Yet they presided over an overwhelmingly Egyptian population. Cleopatra changed that. She learned to speak Egyptian, the first of her line to do so in 300 years. She embraced Egyptian customs. She was crowned as a pharaoh, not just a queen consort. She styled herself as the reincarnation of Isis, the mother goddess. Her image was minted on coins in Egyptian and Roman styles alike. But her kingdom was weak, pressured by internal strife, economic debt, and the growing shadow of Rome. Cleopatra had to do more than rule, she had to survive. And so began her partnerships. First came Julius Caesar. After a brutal power struggle with her brother Ptolemy III, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, possibly rolled inside a carpet. The alliance was strategic and personnel. She bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, and briefly visited Rome with him before Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne, now more precarious than ever. And then came Mark Antony. Their relationship was famously passionate, but also deeply political. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and grain. Cleopatra needed Roman protection. Together, they envisioned a new empire, perhaps even a new world order. They declared Caesarion to be Caesar's rightful heir. Antony granted Cleopatra control of large territory. Rome was outraged. In 31 BCE, Octavian Caesar's adopted heir and future Augustus declared war. At the naval battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated. They retreated to Alexandria. Their fates were sealed. What followed was a collapse of alliances, of armies, of dynasties. Antony, misled by a false report of Cleopatra's death, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, upon seeing him dying, brought him to her mausoleum, where he bled out in her arms. Days later, facing the end, Cleopatra made her own final move. The story goes that she chose death by Asp Beta, symbol of royalty and resurrection. But some historians suggest poison, or even assisted suicide by her servants. However it happened, she died at the age of 39. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province. The age of pharaohs stretching back over 3 millennia was over. But Cleopatra refused to vanish. Her story was retold and distorted. Roman historians painted her as a seductress who ruined great men. Renaissance artists depicted her in tragic splendor. Shakespeare gave her verses. Hollywood gave her eye. She became symbol, myth, metaphor. Yet the truth is more fascinating than any legend. Cleopatra was a ruler who fought to preserve her nation's independence against an unstoppable empire. She used diplomacy, theater, intellect, and when necessary, she built fleets, managed crises, navigated betrayals, and shaped history. Her library was one of the greatest in the world. Her court hosted scholars, engineers, poets. Her city, Alexandria, was the shining beacon of the Mediterranean till fire, war, and time stripped it down to ruins. And through it all, she remained Pharaoh, last of her kind. So as you stand now among broken columns and half-buried sphinx, imagine her, not lounging on a couch of silk but writing a treaty, plotting troop movements, reading Homer in Greek and the Book of the Dead in Egyptian, a queen in a man's world, a ruler at the edge of history. Her crown may have fallen, her empire may be gone, but Cleopatra's shadow still lingers, long, elegant, and unforgettable. Beneath the shifting sands and murky waters of Egypt lie cities that once rivaled Thebes and Memphis. Their walls are gone, their names barely whispered, but once they were centers of trade, ritual, and power until they vanished. Let us begin not in the desert, but beneath the sea. This city once guarded the mouth of the Nile where it met the Mediterranean. Before Alexandria, Heraclean was the grand portal between Egypt and the Greek world. Pharaohs and merchants alike passed through its customs houses. Temples rose above its docks. Statues of gods towered over canals. Ships, laden with incense, gold, and grain, came and went. But then, it disappeared. For centuries, Heraclean was considered a legend. Ancient texts spoke of it, but no one could find it. That is, until 2000, off the coast of modern-day Abukir Bay. Marine archaeologists discovered the ruins perfectly preserved beneath layers of silt and water. Temples, stone inscriptions, dozens of ancient ships, bronze coins, giant statues of Osiris, Isis, and pharaohs. The city had not been lost to war, but to nature. Earthquakes and rising sea levels destabilized the delta. The ground liquefied. Buildings sank. What was once the gateway to Egypt became a memory, buried beneath the waves. Then there is Teniesta, city of forgotten pharaohs. Founded around 1000 BCE in the Nile Delta, Tanis rose as a capital during the 21st and 22nd dynasties, when power fractured and Egypt's might wane. While Thebes held religious authority, Tanis held royal tombs. Pharaohs were buried here alongside their treasures. And yet, Tanis disappeared from collective memory. The desert slowly crept in. Canals dried up. The royal necropolis was buried under centuries of dust. When archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1930s, they found undisturbed tombs a rarity in Egypt. Inside were gold masks, silver coffins, lapis, amulets, jewels, as rich as anything from Tutankhamun's grave, and yet, no one knew their names. Pharaohs like Suzan's-I and Shoshenq II, once kings of Lower Egypt, were forgotten by history, overshadowed by their more famous predecessors. And then there are cities still missing. Ichtoi, the royal city of Amenhotep I, is believed to have once flourished near the Fayum oasis. It ruled during the Middle Kingdom, an era of reform, literature, and stability. But its location remains unknown. Its temples, palaces, and archives gone, buried, hidden beneath layers of agriculture or desert. Other cities, too, flicker at the edge of rediscovery parameters. Once the grand capital of Ramses II was so thoroughly lost that archaeologists confused it with Tanis for years. Its stones were quarried, its statues moved. Now, only its foundations remain, scattered across the fields of Khontia. What causes cities to vanish? Sometimes, it's nature floods, droughts, earthquakes. Sometimes, its politics. Capitals move, dynasties fall, and former centers of power are abandoned. And sometimes, it's just time. A few centuries of disuse, and the desert takes everything. But not forever. In the last few decades, satellite imaging, radar surveys, and underwater excavation have opened a new age of discovery. Whole city grids have emerged beneath rice paddies and fishing villages. Walls, streets, markets, temples, some lie underwater. All whisper fragments of Egypt's forgotten chapters. So now, imagine standing on a windswept plain, looking out over nothing but dust and shrubs. There is no monument here, no visible ruin, just silence. And yet, under your feet, a city sleeps. Statues wait to see sunlight again. Tombs sit undisturbed, sealed for thousands of years. The gods' names still carved into temple lintel. Coins still lying in clay jars. walls still bearing the soot of ancient fires. In Egypt, loss is not always forever. Cities vanish, but the land remembers. And sometimes, all it takes is wind, water, and patience for the past to rise again. The year is 1821. In the heart of Paris, a curious sight draws crowds. A towering obelisk, sphinx, and hieroglyphs, all part of a theatrical set for the magic flute. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt may be long over, but the West is obsessed. Obsession becomes fashion, and fashion becomes mania. This is Egyptomania cultural fever that swept through Europe and America, driven by fascination, fantasy, and a desire to possess the mystery of the ancient Nile. It began with conquest. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt not just with soldiers, but with scholars, scientists, and artists. Their findings were published in the monumental description de l'Egypte, a series of massive volumes that introduced European readers to the monuments, flora, fauna, and mythology of Egypt. Suddenly, the land of pyramids wasn't just exotic, it was academic, artistic, and very fashionable. Soon after, the Rosetta Stone discovered by French soldiers and seized by the British was deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in 1822. For the first time in millennia, the hieroglyphs spoke again. Pharaohs had names. Gods had stories. The silence of stone had been broken. The response: a tidal wave of interest that flooded every corner of Western culture. In architecture, obelisks and columns rose in cemeteries, government buildings, and public monuments. London's Cleopatra's Needle, Paris's Place de la Concorde, and New York's Metropolitan Museum Facade all borrowed ancient styles. Even coffins were shaped like sarcophagi. Egyptian motifs found their way into wallpaper, tea sets, and funerary art. In fashion, women wore Nile green silk, men sported scarab brooches, jewelry mimicked amulets, designers borrowed lotus blossoms, the eye of Horus, and Angs. Victorian England's fascination with death blended neatly with the embalmed beauty of ancient tombs. Then came the mummy unwrapping parties. Yes, wealthy elites in London and Paris would gather in drawing rooms to witness a real mummy being unwrapped. Candles flickered. A professor would speak about the history of the body, and then, layer by layer, the linen would be removed, revealing the face of someone dead for thousands of years. It was bizarre. It was fashionable. Museums raced to acquire Egyptian artifacts. Tomb raiding became a business. Local diggers, foreign collectors, and wealthy benefactors formed networks of supply and demand. Temples were looted, scrolls sold, statues smuggled out in crates labeled as antiques or pottery. By the early 20th century, Egyptomania reached a new height. Howard Carter's 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Newspapers around the globe exploded with headlines. The Boy King unearthed. Curse of the Pharaoh. The press coverage was sensational. King Tut's golden mask became a global icon. And suddenly, everything was Egypt. Cigarette ads featured pyramids. Movie studios rushed to produce films like The Mummy. Art Deco architects are already fond of geometric motifs. Skyscrapers echoed stepped pyramids. Hotels and theaters bore names like Luxor and Thebes. Even music and dance joined the craze. Egyptian-style dances performed by flappers combined fantasy with fragments of temple poses. Hollywood starlets posed in pharaonic regalia. In America, entire casinos and amusement parks were built to resemble ancient cities, though with more neon. But for all its glamour, Egyptomania was rarely about real Egypt. It was a dream, a projection. The West saw in ancient Egypt both mystery and mastery, a culture that seemed timeless, powerful, exotic. But often, it stripped Egypt of its context, complexity, and humanity. Pharaohs became temples became stage sets. Today, Egyptomania lives on. It pulses in Las Vegas, where pyramid-shaped hotels glow under artificial stars. It appears in video games, movies, and pop music. It thrives on social media, where symbols like the Eye of Horus or Anubis resurface with cryptic hashtags and aesthetic edits. And yet, perhaps the most powerful echo of Egyptomania is this. It helped spark global awareness of Egypt's heritage. Even if it began with fantasy and spectacle, it eventually inspired conservation, scholarship, and respect. So next time you see a pyramid-shaped perfume bottle, or walk past a sphinx guarding a museum, remember, you're seeing the shadow of an obsession, a cultural fever that never fully broke. Egyptomania was never just about Egypt. It was about how we see the past and how the past keeps looking back. Imagine standing deep inside a tomb, torchlight flickering against smooth walls painted with gods and pharaohs. But then between carved deities and hieroglyphic prayers you see something unexpected. A scribbled note, scratched hurriedly onto the plaster. A name, a message, a joke. This is not sacred text. It's graffiti, and it tells us something precious. While we often imagine ancient Egypt as timeless, grand, and ceremonial, buried in its tombs and temples are traces of ordinary voices, scribes, workers, lovers, even pranksters who left behind their words like whispers trapped in stone. These are the time capsules of eternity, and they are everywhere. Let's begin in Deir el-Mahd, the village of the artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It was a closed, specialized community of skilled workers, stonecutters, painters, and scribes, who lived, ate, and raised families just steps away from some of the most magnificent tombs ever created. Their walls weren't just decorated with images of gods, they were full of writing, shopping lists, love poems, work complaints, attendance logs, and letters home. One ostrakhan pottery shard used for writing records. A simple message. Send me good fish. The last batch was old. My belly has not forgiven me. Others contained school exercises, where apprentice scribes practiced writing hieroglyphs, or copied popular texts, like the tale of Sin. One shard carries a love poem that reads, "She has no rival. She is more beautiful than all women. When she comes near, my heart rejoices." Not all messages were romantic. Some were grumpy or bureaucratic, absentee slips, inventory of tomb supplies, warnings to lazy co-workers. So-and-so did not show up for work because of a hangover. One note reads bluntly. Then there's tomb graffiti. On the walls of the tomb of Ramses VI, for instance, ancient Greek tourists left behind their names, in big, messy letters. Alexandros was here. Some praised the beauty of the tomb, others simply announced their presence. A few even copied prayers in foreign alphabets, showing just how far Egypt's fame had spread. In one temple, a Roman soldier carved a tiny Latin inscription between two hieroglyphic gods. His words, "I came, I saw, I worshipped." But perhaps the most haunting notes are the letters to the dead. In cemeteries, archaeologists have found shards and papyri, containing personal pleas written by living family members to their departed loved ones. They might ask for protection, forgiveness, or even help solving disputes. "My brother, I know you are in the West, but someone stole my grain. Please speak to the gods and bring me justice." These messages reveal a world where death was not an ending, but a shift in conversation. The dead were still present, still reachable, a part of daily life, even after burial. Even the mighty left behind such. A letter from a princess of Egypt to the Hittite king asks him to send one of his sons to marry her after her husband died, possibly referring to the widow of politics written, in urgency, carried by messengers across empires. And not all messages were written on purpose. Some were accidental. Time capsules, papyrus scraps swept into storage rooms. A worker might scratch a stick figure into the wall, or draw a cat chasing a bird, something to pass time. Never meant to last 3,000 years, but they did. These messages make Egypt human, not just monumental. They show us a people who laughed, argued, flirted, and forgot to bring fish. They remind us that even in an age of pyramids and priests, life was messy, emotional, and full of personality. So as you imagine walking through a tomb, pause and lean close to the wall, not for the grand carvings, but for the faint scratch, the informal ink, the personal line left behind by someone who never imagined you'd read it. A shopping list, a poem, time capsules of eternity.